When it comes to times of conflict, there are some incredibly tough questions, and one of the most critical and maybe one of the most misunderstood is this: what does the Quran actually say about protecting innocent life? In this explainer, we're going to go straight to the source to find out.
You know, the rules of engagement are always complex, but for a lot of people, this is one of the most pressing issues out there.
So let's just get right to it. It's a heavy question, a really uncomfortable one. Does the Quran permit targeting non-combatants, specifically women and children, in a time of war?
Okay, so a lot of the confusion actually comes from what are called secondary texts, the Hadith. These are collections of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions. And here's the problem. You can find narrations that seem to point in opposite directions. On one hand, there's a Hadith that seems to permit it, saying women and children are from the enemy. But then you have multiple other accounts where the Prophet explicitly forbade killing them. So you've got this apparent contradiction, right? That's exactly why we have to go to the primary source for the definitive answer.
So, to sort all this out, we're going to turn to the Quran itself, which is always considered the final authority.
And you know what's really interesting here? The answer we find in the Quran, it isn't vague or kind of open to interpretation. It's actually incredibly direct and, well, uncompromising.
And here it is, from Surah 5. Whoever kills a human being, it would be as if he killed all mankind. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. The act of killing a single person without a specific, just legal cause is treated as something as horrific as killing all of humanity.
The scale of that statement is just staggering. It beautifully illustrates the immense, almost sacred value the Quran places on every single innocent life. It's not just a personal tragedy, it's framed as a cosmic one. Now, the key thing here is that the verse itself lays out the exceptions. This isn't some blanket prohibition on a state carrying out justice. The exceptions are very specific and they're legally defined.
So one exception is for murder, which makes sense. The other is for this very specific legal term, fasad. So what is that? Well, think of it as large-scale violent crimes that threaten to tear a society apart. Things like terrorism or an armed rebellion. But here's the crucial part. Any punishment is for the people who actually commit those acts, not for innocent civilians caught in the middle.
Okay, so that's the principle. But what about the messy reality of war? What about unintended deaths, or what today we might call collateral damage? Does this principle still hold up?
This is really where the rubber meets the road. What happens when innocent people are mixed in with combatants?
The Quran actually gives us this fascinating case study in Surah 48. Picture this. Muslim forces are in the Valley of Makkah. They are on the absolute brink of a major victory. But there's a huge complication. There are believers, men and women, living secretly among the enemy population. If they attack, they will almost certainly harm these innocents without even knowing it.
So, what was the command in this incredibly high-stakes situation? The verse says God withheld their hands. The attack was called off. And the reason given is spelled out right there, to avoid harming the believers that you didn't even know were mixed in with the enemy.
And this right here is the critical takeaway. The absolute need to protect potential innocents was so important that it actually overrode a major military objective. There wasn't some calculation of acceptable losses. The risk of harming even one innocent was just too great.
So we've seen the core principle and a really powerful real-world application of it. But you might be wondering, is this just a guideline for a specific time and place, or is it something bigger?
Well, that very same chapter of the Quran frames this principle as something much more fundamental. It's not a suggestion. It's presented as an unchanging, universal system. The verse says, "This is God's law, and you will never find any change in God's laws."
The term for this whole concept is sunnatullah, and a good way to think about it is like a law of nature, something as fundamental and constant as, say, gravity. So from this perspective, protecting innocence isn't just a moral choice. It's described as being woven into the very fabric of how the universe is ordered.
All right, so let's quickly recap the big takeaways here. First, killing one innocent person is treated as if you've killed all of humanity. Second, this is an absolute rule with only very narrow, legally defined exceptions. Third, the need to protect innocents can be so important it can even stop a military operation in its tracks. And finally, this whole principle is presented as an unchanging, universal law of God, sunnatullah.
And all of this leaves us with one last, pretty tough question to think about. If the Quran's stance on protecting innocent life is this clear, this absolute and this fundamental. Why is it so often ignored, even by people who claim to follow the text? That's definitely a question worth pondering.